Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the BFA class review series. My name is Mr. Couchy, and I will lay out for you some of the changes affecting Unholy Death Knights going into battle for Azeroth. Although we are close to the end of beta, some of this is still subject to change, so don't take everything said here as law. Unholy Death Knights held the steady lead on DPS for DKs in raids and dungeons throughout Legion's entirety. A fairly balanced AoE and single target kit, along with a great fantasy, albeit slightly disgusting, and wicked utility made them welcome into any raid, dungeon, or PvP world. Death Grip, a battle res, and anti-magic shell made them fairly difficult to kill, only offset by their lack of mobility. How many times did a boss get pulled while you were still hanging out in the other room? Let's see how they fare in BFA. Dark Sucre, when you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor, your next death strike within 20 seconds is free and heals for an additional 10% of max health. Death's Advance, for 8 seconds your movement speed is increased by 30%, you cannot be slowed below 100% of normal speed, and you are immune to forced movement effects and knockbacks. This is passive, and you cannot be slowed below 70% of normal speed. The cooldown has been changed from none to 45 seconds. Raise Ally, your battle res will allow targets to re-enter with 60% health and 20% mana, but the cost has been changed from none to 30 runic power. You have also received Apocalypse baseline. Bring Doom upon your enemy, dealing shadow damage and bursting up to 4 festering wounds on the target. Summons an army of the dead ghoul for 15 seconds for each burst festering wound. Army of the Dead, you summon a legion of ghouls over 4 seconds who swarm your enemies, fighting anything they can for 30 seconds, and the cooldown has been changed from 10 to 8 minutes. Dark Transformation, you transform your minion into a powerful undead monstrosity for 15 seconds. The minion's abilities are empowered and take on new functions while the transformation is active. Your Death Coil, you fire a blast of unholy energy at the target, dealing shadow damage to an enemy and restoring 10 energy to your abomination or ghoul. It reduces the cooldown of Dark Transformation by a second. The cost changed from 45 runic power to 40. Festering Strike strikes for physical damage and inflicts the target with 2 to 3 festering wounds. A festering wound applies a pustulent lesion that will burst on death or when damaged by Scourge Strike, dealing shadow damage and generating 3 runic power. It stacks up to 6 times on any target. Icebound Fortitude has been buffed to reduce the damage you take by 30% for 8 seconds. And your Mastery increases the damage of your shadow damage abilities by 1%. Outbreak deals shadow damage and surrounds the target in a miasma lasting for 6 seconds that infects nearby enemies with virulent plague. Raise Dead raises a minion to fight by your side. You can have a maximum of 1 minion at a time, and the cooldown has been changed from a minute to 30 seconds. Runic Corruption, each runic power you spend has a 1% chance to increase your rune regeneration rate by 100% for 3 seconds. And finally, Death Strike. Death Strike's healing is increased by 40%. That is quite a few baseline changes, and it keeps on going into the talents. Blighted Rune Weapon, Corpse Shield, Castigator, Dark Arbiter, Dark Infusion, Debilitating Infestation, Lingering Apparition, Necrosis, and Sludge Belcher have all been removed. In their places, you have Army of the Damned. Death Coil and Epidemic reduce the cooldown of Apocalypse by a second and Army of the Dead by 5 seconds. Death Pact, you create a Death Pact that heals you for 50% of your max health, but absorbs incoming healing equal to 30% of your max health for 15 seconds. Death's Reach increases the range of Death Grip by 10 yards. Killing the enemy that yields experience or honor resets the cooldown of Death Grip. Harbinger of Doom, Sudden Doom now triggers 15% more often and can accumulate up to 2 charges. Grip of the Dead, Defile or Death and Decay reduces the movement speed of enemies within its area by 90%, decaying by 10% every second. Pestilence, Death and Decay damage has a 10% chance to apply a festering wound to the enemy. Unholy Blight, surround yourself with a vile swarm of insects for 6 seconds, stinging all nearby enemies and infecting them with an unholy disease that deals damage over 14 seconds. Summon Gargoyle, you summon a gargoyle into the area to bombard the target for 30 seconds. The gargoyle gains 1% increased damage for every 2 runic power you spend. And finally, Wraithwalk. You sidestep into the Shadowlands, removing all rune effects and increasing your movement speed by 70% for 4 seconds. Taking any action cancels the effect, and while active, your movement speed cannot be reduced below 170%. The cooldown has also been changed from 45 seconds to a minute. There are some changes to your other current talents. All will serve. Your Raise Dead spell summons an additional skeletal minion. Asphyxiate lifts the target off the ground, crushing their throat with dark energy and stunning them for 5 seconds. Bursting Sores, festering wounds deal 25% more damage when burst, and all enemies within 8 yards of a burst festering wound suffer shadow damage. Defile, you defile the targeted ground, dealing shadow damage to all enemies over 10 seconds. While you remain within your defile, your Clawing Shadows or Scourge Strike will hit all enemies near the target. If any enemies are standing in the defile, it grows in size every second, and the cooldown has been changed from 30 seconds to 20 seconds. Ebon Fever, Virulent Plague deals 15% more damage over time and half the duration. Epidemic had its cost changed from none to 30 runic power, the cooldown changed from 10 seconds to none, and charges changed from 3 to none. Infected Claws, your Abomination's Cleaver or Ghoul's Claw attack have a 30% chance to cause a festering wound on the primary target. Pestilent Pustules, bursting a festering wound has a 10% chance to grant you runic corruption. Soul Reaper, rip out an enemy's soul, dealing shadow damage over 8 seconds. If the enemy that yields experience or honor dies while afflicted by Soul Reaper, you gain 10% haste for 8 seconds and generates 2 runes. Spell Leader, Anti-Magic Shell absorbs 30% more damage and lasts 5 seconds longer. And finally, Unholy Frenzy incites you into Killing Frenzy for 12 seconds, increasing haste by 20% and causing your auto attacks to infect the target with a festering wound. The cooldown has been changed to 1.25 minutes. So Unholy is actually pretty fun. The micromanagement of the festering wounds on your targets, but with less RNG, makes it feel much better. The additional utility with Grip of the Dead will make sure your enemies don't go anywhere and will be especially beneficial when your dungeon tank needs to kite for their life. The ramp up is lessened and the class fantasy stays intact and doesn't see any side effects. Unholy has come a long way since Alpha started, turning from virtually unplayable to quite entertaining, and ripping up the damage meter along the way. How did you think Unholy felt in Legion, and how do you think it will perform in BFA? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Thanks for sticking around, like and subscribe, and in case I don't see ya, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.